in socialism, the most important thing, distinguishing factor of socialism, emphasis on equality.
Welcome back to another episode of Overlap. Very happy to be back with you here. I am Eugene Puryear from Breakthrough News, and this show is a partnership with our friends at Wave Media, a private media house in China, looking at all of the various ways China and the U.S. overlap and diverge to help break through all of the propaganda behind the Cold War atmosphere between the two nations. Today on Overlap, we want to talk a little bit about culture in the United States and China and the perceptions of the two countries that are driven by the mainstream media and the entertainment industry here in the United States in particular, and how that contributes to how both countries see one another and thus how policies can and could potentially be shaped. We are very, very honored to be joined as we continue the show here today by Chris Young, who is an editor at Guansha, which is another private media house in China. And also he's making videos for Bilibili. He's commenting on Chinese social media. He's someone who has a great deal of knowledge about what's happening in both countries. And I have to say, Chris, I'm really excited to be here talking with you today.
It's my honor. It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me here, Eugene.
No, so excited to have you, and honestly, just really excited to even have this project, because I think one of the things, certainly for me, and I think for a lot of us who are watching, is we're often wondering not just what's going on in China, but what the perception is of American culture and American entertainment in China.
Well, that's a great question, Eugene. Chinese people, in my opinion, they know quite a lot about the U.S. They know what is going on. For example, with the midterm election, they know U.S. foreign policy, especially when it comes to dealing with China. We are more active in reaching out, in going out to seek information. English is the global lingua franca, and we have this passing knowledge of it, more so than the United States, the Americans have on Mandarin. So we get to know more about the West. So we know what has been distorted. And we know that some of you think that we don't know a damn thing, that we are just brainwashed robots, mindlessly promoting the official party line. Actually, we're okay with that. So keep it that way, because it doesn't hurt. They consume actively US cultural products like Hollywood movies, pop music, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say they have a sense of what's going on in the US. They can name probably way more US stars than the United States. I mean, in America, the people in America could name Chinese stars.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that's definitely true. We know that just like every other country, you're bombarded with the movies, the TV shows, obviously, your own perceptions of the news, and of course, the various, U.S. entities that are trying to influence the whole global stage. What sense do they get of what's happening in the United States, the political debates and all of the different sort of controversies? I think a lot of them, we know on a daily basis. I don't know if they filter through to China, from cancel culture to, how racism plays out, to all the different things that are roiling our politics day to day. I wonder if people in China get a sense of that and how they view these different questions.
Let's talk about the Amazon show, The Rings of Power. I think that's something that's made a splash in Chinese social media, because I knew in the US, people were criticizing the cast. They say, okay, these people are not supposed to play as elves because they are color. And in certain part of Chinese cyberspace, there are people who are sympathetic to that kind of racist argument. I think that's quite interesting. But I would like to hear what you say about it.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting question. And as you know, I mean, that's obviously, as you mentioned, such a huge undercurrent in the United States about Lord of the Rings. The same thing is true with The Little Mermaid.
Yeah.
To a lesser extent, the new Game of Thrones too, similar conversation around it. Now, some of I think the number one thing people say here in the US as a pushback is, well, these are all fantasy stories anyway. So,
Exactly.
what does it really matter who plays what and who does what? But I do think that it hits on an interesting conversation here in the United States that has been so huge, certainly since the Trump presidency, but, really going back to the 1990s in a big way when this started happening in Hollywood with more diversity, which is the two sides to the coin. Because on the one side, there is the issue of, representation, the importance of representation, the fact that until, really very recently, almost, you think about the United States, which is a country that is almost at this point half non-white people. Depending on what state, it's actually a majority. But until very recently, the vast majority of people, I'm talking 80, 90% of people on TV and movies were white people and white people exclusively. And in fact, until Marvel put out Black Panther a few years ago, it was widely considered in Hollywood, well, nobody will ever watch a movie, with Black people as the stars because Americans are too racist. Now, of course, Black Panther showed that was not true. So really what's happening in Hollywood is a reflection of the fact that I think most people in the US want to see themselves portrayed not exclusively, but something like if I was to go out into the real world, it would seem like the people I'm seeing and I'm around. But that's one side to the coin. On the second side, you can get a lot more, Black characters, Latino characters, Asian characters in TV and movies, but you can't really get any significant change in the disparities that exist in terms of access to housing, where Black people especially have less access to housing, in terms of poverty, where the rates of poverty, which are pretty high in America, about 150 million people live in poverty, but more so among non-white populations. All these, obviously policing, which people have heard about. So it's almost like a concern that the sort of woke culture, if you will, is being used as almost like a narcotic to put people to sleep, right? Like, oh, well, we put more of you on TV, so it's okay. But in reality, there's all these other problems that aren't being addressed.
Or we call it 白左. We see woke culture, or we call it 白左, means white left or Western left. So it's become a laughing stock or insult on Chinese internet. I think that's one, because Chinese netizens are unaware of the existence of deeply structural, or if you will, systemic inequalities in the United States. So much so that you need to stay woke, stay vigilant all the time. I think it was a country for the white people. So it wasn't designed for the people of color. So the night is dark and full of terrors. Without that knowledge, Chinese netizens are easy to believe in the right-wingers, the rhetorics. If you look at Tucker Carlson, he picked up the trend in China and turned into a weapon against the progressive left on his show. He said, okay, the Chinese people are mocking us. In China, there are many people adopting US right-wing views on Black Lives Matter, feminist movement, gender equality, and so on and so forth. But bear in mind, in 1963, Chairman Mao published a statement supporting the American Negroes in their just struggle against racial discrimination by the US imperialism. It was well received by the likes of Malcolm X and so on and so forth. We take it and we say, okay, that's the liberalists' 白左's evil scheme, to make people not really aware of the real injustices, which is the injustice among classes, which is right, I would say. So I think that the key reason that 白左 or Western liberalism, Western leftism was laughed at was because liberalism, whose goal is to reform rather than burying capitalism, has taken over the vacuum left by communism or socialism, and that has grown so powerful that it becomes the new face of imperialism. China is a socialist country since its inception, and America is a capitalist country. It made a huge difference. Because liberalism, what it does is to make peace with capitalism. It means to gloss over those fundamental inequalities among classes. Whereas in socialism, the most important thing, distinguishing factor of socialism, emphasis on equality. A lot of Chinese people, they see the US as a country that is run by the elite. And the elite, they have vested interest in Wall Street, in Silicon Valley, and it's almost like the sort of populist movement in the United States means the demise or potential demise of the US empire and reinstatement of the republic.
I think is interesting about relating that history to China today. Like even listening to the discourse around the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of China, and you still hear words like class struggle being used, socialism being used, is this is sort of our class struggle in a way, at least in the Black community especially, is there's all these liberals who are like, yes, we're going to talk about racism, we're going to talk about all these bad things, but then they won't actually do the things that are required to address them because that means they have to address capitalism. And so you can have someone like a Barack Obama, he can become the president. I don't think he's a racist. Obviously, he's a Black man, but his impact on the Black population, and which is majority working class, majority poor, was very small. Because to address the issue of inordinate housing, you look at even jobs. I mean, you'd have to create to have basically 100% employment amongst Black people who could work in America because of structural unemployment. You'd essentially have to create more jobs in a year than the entire economy creates for all workers. So obviously you would have to have a big change in the mode of production and how the structure of the economy in America to address that. And these big liberals, they don't want to address it at all because they view it as, hey, capitalism's working for us. So they want to try to, use the rhetorical, the fact that they'll talk about it, the fact that they'll, do something in Hollywood, which is good. It's good to talk about it. It's good to have it, but they use that as a smokescreen.
You mentioned earlier that China used its old rhetoric in the 20th Party Congress. But then I wish to say that there is something new. I looked through it. I found there's a phrase. It said it's the Chinese way of modernization. Well, it's different from what was previously known as the China model, the China way, because China model is a model that others may look up to, and it has the potential to be exported. And if China were to play the role of a missionary, let's say, then it's bound to clash with the United States, who has been playing that role, spreading the gospel for a long time, So if you go down the path of head-on rivalry, it's going to be a mortal struggle with the United States. The best outcome could be what Khrushchev once said, we will bury you. But, from a realist perspective, the US empire will never tolerate a peer competitor, so it will strike back with full force. So I think this new way of phrasing it is more clever. It puts forward the idea of Chinese way of modernization. It's an implicit acknowledgement of the Western way of modernization, but also it's a wake-up call to the rest, a gentle reminder to the West that, okay, modernity is not singular, is not restricted to one Western version. We should imagine and develop different multiple versions of modernities.
No, I think that's super important. And I wish those were the things that were picked out by the US media, but of course they always just want to look for something bad that they can say anything about China somehow, some way. It keeps coming back around to the general theme, I think, of how powerful the US media, which by the way, is about 80% owned or, something like that, majority owned by about 5 companies. And when I say 5 companies, we're really talking about the elite owners of these companies. They're big, huge, publicly traded companies owned by big investors. So this tiny clique of people who are basically deciding how China is going to be portrayed, not just in the news, but also in movies, different things like that, and controlling people's narratives, and also sort of preventing the reality of American people. I mean, just to go to an issue that conservatives bring up a lot about crime, everywhere in America, whether we're talking about the local news in the cities and the towns or the big national news, portrays all criminals basically as Black, essentially. And you would never know that according to all of the actual official statistics, the majority of people who commit crimes are white.
I think what we said keeps going back to media distortions. I want to go back to the beginning where we had a friendly relationship between China and the West. And then over the years, we became increasingly disillusioned with each other. So there was a time when, panda huggers in the United States were, they wanted to change China to their liking through engagement. And China was eager to play along what was essentially a US-led order because that represented progress. And China was so desperate to catch up. So in that stage, okay, people in China opened up not only its borders, but also its mind. People were much more receptive and willing to adopt Western ideas. In a certain way, it's a reaction to its former Soviet legacy. So basically, that generation of Chinese people trusted Western media so much so that everything it said was accepted as objective facts. If they contradicted with reality on the ground, then our society must be somehow at fault and needed to change. So this trend lasted for decades until, I would say, until around 2008 Beijing Olympic Games. I recently listened to a BBC podcast when the hostess lamented that China was much more open, much more friendly, reform-minded. Back then, the China watchers in the West were euphoric because China to them was finally on the right path of convergence to the West. But then it was also around that time when Chinese nationalism started to grow and people realized we cannot become who you liked if it means that we shouldn't become who we like to become. So over the years, the Chinese people become more and more disillusioned with the paragon of Western journalism. And then they realized, okay, probably that journalism isn't real journalism, but journalistic propagandas. I think in the United States, many people think they have this free thinking, the freedom of thoughts. But I think unconsciously, they are indoctrinated by top quality journalistic propaganda. The current situation between US and China is obviously not beautiful. And I think it's due to the inability to understand each other's perspective and predicament. You can say the same. It's true for the US side to China because it doesn't understand China, where to a certain extent, it is the same in China that we couldn't understand, for example, social justice in the United States, what are you people fighting for? I think it's very important that we convey this message across a wider platform. So our conversation could serve as a bridge between our cultures. So upon this bridge, we can build a shared future. That's what China would like to say to the world: the shared future, a better world.
Mm-hmm. Well, Chris, I hope this is the first conversation of many. I was thrilled to have the opportunity to meet you, to have this conversation.
Thank you, Eugene.
I love this show, love Overlap. This is like a great opportunity. So I just really appreciate you chatting with me, man.
Yeah.